Welcome back to Confessions of a Time Monk. Today we're in the healing biotope, the eco-village called Tamera, which is in Portugal. And over the past 10 days, we've been part of a gathering called Defend the Sacred, where there have been activists invited from all over the planet to come together. And at the core of this group are actually the people who initiated the opposition to the Dakota pipeline at Standing Rock. Today we're actually sitting with one of the Indigenous members of Turtle Island, so Pat McCabe, who is an elder in the Dene people. And you shared with me that you've been adopted into the traditions of the Lakota people as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Pat, I'm interested in looking at through your eyes at this experience, this time here in Tamera at this gathering. What's been significant for you in this coming together?
Well, as someone who had a lived experience of interrupted earth-based culture, meaning that maybe some people know that on Turtle Island there was a deep campaign that was called Kill the Indian, Save the Man.
Wow.
That was literally what it was called.
And what years are we talking about
And so
now?
this was 1800s. And so first the plan was just outright genocide, like to just kill everybody. But at some point, and I'm very curious about this, which I mean to look into, there was like a shift in consciousness maybe, and conscience, of where it was said, okay, maybe we don't actually need to kill the people, but we can change them into who we want them to be. So this really deep assimilation process took place. And my family's history is very embedded in that process. So my people were incarcerated in a concentration camp.
And what part of?
In the southern part of New Mexico.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, and in that process, a lot of us were killed because the mandate was that any male member of my people who could lift a gun had to turn themselves into the U.S. government, or could be captured or killed on sight. And so a lot of people turned themselves in, a lot of people were captured, a lot of people hid. Anyway, it was a time of great upheaval. And we went down to this concentration camp and stayed there. And at a certain point, they decided to let us out. And in order for us to leave the concentration camp, we had to sign a treaty that said that we would send our children to their schools. And so we signed the treaty.
And so how many generations back are we speaking about now? How many generations have had this assimilation process imposed upon them?
So for my people, it was about 3 generations.
Okay. So you are the 3rd generation?
I'm the 3rd generation.
Okay.
Right. So I guess now that I have children and grandchildren, we could actually say 5. But for me, I was the 3rd generation. And so, so the U.S. government and the churches took on this task of taking these children. So there were there were governmental boarding schools. So these were residential schools, right? And there were Catholic residential schools, and there were Protestant residential schools.
And these have persisted.
And they're still here. They still exist. It's not mandatory to send your child there anymore, but they do still exist. So my grandparents, in my grandparents' generation, the kids could be legally just taken. If they were just seen anywhere, they could just be taken, because that was the law that we had agreed to send them to the schools. So when they came to my grandmother's house, she was the only one home of the kids, and her brothers and sisters weren't there. And so she was the only one who was taken. So that created in her family this dynamic of half of her brothers and sisters remaining in our traditional ways and in their traditional home, and then she was taken into this very different situation, right? And so from there, she ended up sending her kids to the residential boarding school. So part of that had to do with religious belief in that the prospect of, your children going to hell was a big motivator.
Right.
And so you have to also understand that, these are people who are working a lot with spiritual entities, right? And so that whole cosmology.
You're speaking about the traditional
the traditional way, right? And so the cosmology of Christianity had certain elements that were somewhat familiar, we could say, in the traditional culture. So that's why it's very effective, and that's why it's been devastating to culture worldwide.
And so your family is essentially a microcosm of a great injustice that's happened globally to Indigenous peoples.
Yes.
And
exactly.
you're a generation, so at what point did you become aware of the fact that there was this division of culture within your own family?
Quite late. Quite late, really. I really didn't understand what I was a product of for a long time. I didn't understand the dynamic that was going on inside of me. I didn't understand what was going on culturally, and I didn't understand what was going on globally for many, many years. I would say till probably certainly a beginning of an awareness was about at age 22.
And what catalyzed that for you?
Meeting a non-native man who I fell in love with, and he was so outraged at the treatment of Indigenous people that he was the one who was sort of informing me more about it, right?
This is an interesting dynamic. This is quite an interesting dynamic in terms of how our personal relationships, how our love relationships can actually open our eyes and open our global hearts to a bigger story than our individual stories.
Yes, definitely. So, so by the time I came along, I'd had 2 generations before me that had been sent to the boarding schools. Well, and I'll also say, because also on my father's side, my grandmother had 12 kids. And so at the same time that our systems of living were being dismantled, I won't say they were completely dismantled, because they have managed to make it through to some degree, but they were being deeply dismantled, and at the same time, the U.S. government's economic system was heading for its collapse and eventually collapsed. So this was the Great Depression, as they call it, right? And so now our system has been broken down, and we were supposed to be transferred into this other system, which then also broke down. And so we were in a bind. And so my grandmother on my father's side talks about how she was actually relieved to have a place to send the kids, these 12 kids, to have food, clothing, and shelter.
You mean in terms of the governmental system that had been created?
So my family was sent to missionary boarding schools. Right, so that was kind of random. Like you could have just gone with government, and then you wouldn't have had the whole spiritual aspect as part of your indoctrination, assimilation process. Or you could have randomly become a Catholic, and suddenly you're assimilated into the whole Catholic culture. And my family was assimilated into the Dutch Christian Reformed Missionary Church. Very, very strict branch of the church, right? And so it was random, so to speak. Where you ended up.
Right.
So this is how they ended up there. So I'll say that it's complex. It's very complex. We would like to say, terrible, terrible, but here's my grandmother saying, thank God.
Right.
Thank God I had some place where my kids could be fed, so that we could survive.
Right.
Right. So all that, this is all trying to come up to the answer of Tamera, right? And but it's relevant because, so then for me, by the time I came along, people weren't speaking our language. People weren't practicing our culture, our spiritual practices. And so I was basically being raised as an American girl. And the missionary school that my parents went to was very intent on education.
So it was rigorous in terms of the educational process.
And they kept telling the kids, if you go and get educated, your problems are gonna get solved. So on the one hand, that is sort of a devastating assimilation practice in relative to our culture. On the other hand, it's better than probably at some of the other schools where they were told you're never going to become anything and you're always going to be the lowest of the low, and et cetera. So in that sense, I'm grateful that at least they were pointing to some way,
right,
and telling these kids that they had an opportunity to be something valuable, right? And so my parents really took that on really deeply. So I was groomed to be, well, I would say my father's perspective when he came out of that whole situation was to say, we're going to beat them at their own game. And we can beat them at their own game.
So there was still an identification with your cultural roots as a people, or was there?
Barely, barely. Only in that place of opposition. That part stayed. Now we have one member of our community here who talks about how the people of Turtle Island are inherently resistant to authority. And so when I heard that, I'm thinking, yeah, I know that guy. That's my dad. My dad was like, and I really have deep respect for him, because really he was saying, I felt like when I look at his life, it's not something that he talked about a lot, but when I look at his life, I realize what he was saying was, whatever you throw at me, I will beat it. Even if you throw a rigged economic system at me, I'm still going to beat it.
Wow.
I'm still going to come out up on top, And so he ended up going to begin work on his PhD at Stanford University in the United States, one of the most prestigious colleges in the United States.
So highly academically achieving.
Highly academic achieving. He ended up being president of Native colleges.
This is your
throughout
father.
the United States, yes. So now I have a brother who also went to Stanford. My daughter went to Stanford. My niece and nephew went to Stanford. So this principle of education was really took hold in my family. And it's interesting because when I travel across the world to like Bali, and I talk to them about what happened, what our situation was, and really what I was talking to them about was this no woman's land that I found myself in, which was that, here I am, I look like this, right? And so people look at me and they think, well, there's a Native American woman. Gosh, I've always wanted to know some things about that culture. Even when I was young, right? So they would come up to me and say, well, how do you do this? How do your people do this? And what's your language like? And how do you say this? And I had no idea, right? I mean, sometimes I used to make it up just because I was so uncomfortable with having to say.
Yeah, you wanted to please the people who are looking to you for this information.
Right, and yet when I also went back to my own family, and this was very specific to my family. I think family to family, people dealt with it in different ways. But this was a phenomenon that is talked about with these residential boarding schools, because these kids were only allowed to come home 3 weeks out of the year.
Wow.
And so they've been indoctrinated into an entirely different culture. I mean, their haircut, their clothing, everything, right? And then they come back into deep indigenous way of being, which was their home, and they're so foreign. And so that's what I also experienced, even though I wasn't a part of the residential boarding schools. My grandmother would take me to visit her siblings, and clearly I was a Martian to them.
Right, so you had cousins and extended family who had grown up in these traditional ways.
I didn't have very much contact with those ones.
You didn't,
but occasionally I would visit my grandmother's siblings, and it became clear that I was too foreign for anybody to be comfortable with my presence there.
Right.
And so there's stories about this, about how the kids just stopped going
That
home.
must be devastating to come back into your family in that way and not be recognized.
Yeah, even as a child. I mean, maybe they thought I was too young to notice, but I noticed, And so that pain of just feeling like, wow, okay, so not here and not here, then what? Then what, right? And so, So I recognize, so this is what I was talking about with the ladies from Bali, is that phenomenon. And also, when your people talk to you in your own language, and I love the sound of our language. I love our language.
And when you say our language, you're speaking about
Dene.
Lakota or Dene?
Dene Bazad.
Okay.
Yeah, so right now I'm talking all about Dene,
Dene.
although these things also happen in the Lakota communities. But this is my family's history. So being adopted into the Lakota spiritual way of life came later in my life. But so to have somebody speak my language or people's language to me, and I like to just listen to it for a while. But I know there's going to come a point where I finally have to say, tip my hand and say, I don't understand. I don't know what you're saying to me. And about 99 times out of 100, what would come back to me is, shame on you. Shame on you that you don't
that's
understand our
interesting.
language.
You know, again, you're speaking about a microcosm right now of what's happening globally in this aspect of you're transparent about the fact that you don't understand and you would like to understand, and then if you're shamed for it, it doesn't leave you in a place to be transparent in the future.
That's right.
And I think that's again, you know, a clue to what's happening both in our global family and in our interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
So how do you, from your perspective, think we make this leap beyond that dynamic of being shamed for our lack of knowledge or being shamed for our identification with something that's felt like home?
Well, so I want to back up to what you're saying. This is a microcosm of the global situation. And so when I spoke about that experience to these women in Bali, they just fell in my arms crying. And they said, that's our story. That's what happens here. So the generations of how this is played out are almost line up globally. And that was the first time I ever had this idea that, wow, this is a global phenomenon.
I get goosebumps because this is the piece of this that I think is so important for our generation, those of us who are gathered here, to look at. Our personal stories are important, but we're in fact now able to step back and see those as representative of this bigger picture, this bigger cultural wounding that we're addressing.
Right. So that knowledge that this was a global family problem. So now, you know, I was on a panel and I said this part, but I'd like to say it here is, you know, so I realized this is not Pat's heartache for having to go visit Aunt so-and-so.
Right.
It's not only that, it's also that, but it's not only that. And it's not, you know, the people who went to this particular boarding school, the Rehoboth Missionary Boarding School. It's not only their issue, it was all the boarding schools, and who knows what happened in all those ones. That information is finally coming out about what actually took place. And these are residential boarding schools in Canada as well. And then it's not only the United States, it's not only my people, but it's all the tribes of the United States, and then in Canada, and then going across the world and realizing, wow, a similar phenomenon took place here. So as I said the other day, you know, this is a global family issue, and I think that's what you're really feeling. And so for me, with that, it was kind of it might sound strange, but there was a certain kind of relief in it as well, to have it be taken out of the personal, the intensely devastating personal, which was leading me to destroy myself,
Right.
With the pain and the confusion of it all, into feeling like, well, wait a second, this is beyond me. So it's that sense of I'm not alone here.
You're part of a collective.
Boy, am I not alone.
This is a collective trauma.
It's kind of scary how not alone I am in this,
Right.
but at the same time, I'm not alone. And so then suddenly a neutrality sort of came over me, and that allowed me to be able to think about it in new ways. Like you say, that distance. So the other day I said, part of the way I deal with personal pain and personal trauma, sometimes to my detriment, but mostly I think to the good, is by that zooming out. To zoom out and find the largest possible perspective about these things. And every time I do, these amazing solutions can come. It's only when I'm staying right here, right?